Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we use data to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany, as always. Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us, this time in Hong Kong. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So in the second half of the show, we're going to be continuing the series that we started last week on the economics of love. We'll be talking specifically about the economics of chocolate. So stick around, some fascinating territory to cover there. But first, something more from the news, and the data point there is $220 billion. That is the net worth as of February 2023 of Bernard Arnault. That makes him the richest man in the world officially.
Going viral today is the new lineup of the world's richest people on the Bloomberg Billionaires Index. Elon Musk, once worth as much as $340 billion, was dethroned as the world's richest person. Today, Bernard Arnault, the founder of LVMH, took the title instead.
One of the most important businessmen in the world, certainly the most important in France right now.
He is the CEO of LVMH Moet Hennessy Louis Vuitton, which is basically the first word in luxury.
Now, for people in the United States, that may be an unfamiliar name, at least compared with our own oligarchs, the mega rich like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. But Arnault is a fixture in his native country of France, so we thought we'd dig in and try to introduce him to the rest of us. So, Adam, just to start with basics, how exactly did Bernard Arnault come to his massive wealth?
Well, I think like most other extremely wealthy people, he didn't start off poor. He comes from a business family from the industrial, now quite hardscrabble textile town of Roubaix. His father owned a civil engineering company. And Arnault, who came up through the classic French elite track, he went to the École Polytechnique, the chief engineering school of France. Pushed his father. He's born 49, so he comes into his own in the 70s, and he pushes his father to take the company out of civil engineering and move them into real estate. He successfully repackages the company as a real estate firm, sells a slice of its interests. And then in the 80s, through his excellent contacts in government circles, gets wind of the fact that the French government is looking for somebody to take over the textile and retail conglomerate, the center of which was the Christian Dior business, which at the time was in serious financial trouble. And again, exploiting this network of excellent contacts that he has, he partners up with the investment bank Lazard Frères. He forms a financial holding company, and with that, then sets about taking charge of, what we'll call, it's the Boussac Saint-Frère empire, but actually, to the world, it's known essentially as Christian Dior. He acquires a controlling interest in that group, proceeds to strip it of all but its most essential workforce, acquiring a fearsome reputation. The guy goes by the moniker of Terminator. He sacked thousands and thousands of people, which was a promise he had made not to do as part of the takeover. He then, with Moet Hennessy, the champagne brand, and Louis Vuitton, founds LVMH. And then in a ruthless 2-year struggle between 87 and 89, blocks an effort by the Louis Vuitton interest to take charge of LVMH and flips the deal on them, so that instead he emerges as the controlling shareholder in the LVMH fashion luxury conglomerate, which is now his vehicle for spectacular wealth.
Yeah, and reading about LVMH, this company that is responsible for his wealth, as you described, it clearly specializes in luxury products of various kinds. And that got me wondering about whether luxury is a coherent industry of its own. What exactly is the luxury industry selling? Because it seemed to me it's a kind of reference to high quality products relative to other kinds of products of its own kind. So how does a company specialize in something so inherently variable and relational as this kind of adjective luxury?
Yeah, I think you point to an important tension. Obviously, you're right. Like in common parlance, luxury is just a general indicator of quality, a certain generosity, money no object kind of excess, privilege, quality, and so on. But in business speak nowadays, it refers quite distinctly to the cluster of high end, high valued, high brand value goods, which are in the fashion space, leather goods, handbags, quintessentially, fine jewelry, of which the most exclusive is, not, essentially made to measure for individual clients. The same is true, of course, of the very high end fashion. Writing instruments, so pens, watches, cars, perfumes, yachts, interior design, the most high end real estate, the most high end hotels, the most luxurious food brands, I don't know, caviar or something like that, wine and spirits, and particularly champagne, cars up to a point, and we're kind of really talking Ferrari more than Porsche when we're in the real luxury end. Various types of spa products, massage, wellness products, and then antiques and ultimately art. And it's a fluid category, essentially shaped inherently, as you're saying, by taste. And taste is obviously debatable, and in some sense, is perhaps not debatable, except it is sociologically real. How people behave and what they choose to value is something that we may not be able to fully explain, but we can certainly map it. And by being able to map it, we can then make money out of it, or the brands which cater to this market can. And it's a huge market, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of quality spending, luxury spending that falls under this moniker.
Now, when I think about Arnault, I realize that the first time I came upon his name was about 10 years ago, and it was in reference to threats he was making at the time to abdicate his French citizenship. This was during the presidency of Francois Hollande, the predecessor of Emmanuel Macron, who was from the Socialist Party. Hollande wanted to raise wealth taxes, and yeah, Arnault's response was to say he was going to give up his French passport and move to Belgium and become a Belgian. That caused all sorts of controversy in France. He ultimately didn't do it, but it did get me wondering whether this kind of threat is common and whether there's a pull factor here, whether other European countries are trying to attract Europe's ultra wealthy. I mean, is that something that European countries are competing over the ultra rich like Arnault?
Yeah, I mean they do, but not as much as American states compete with each other and American counties. I mean, if you think about the way in which Florida, for instance, took advantage of the COVID crisis to attract ultra high net worth individuals from New York, um, or Sun Valley or locations like that. Compete quite overtly with ultra low property taxes and low income taxes. But yes, absolutely, there is competition. I mean, it's also worth saying that if you come from Roubaix, I mean, Roubaix is essentially on the border with Belgium, so
Hmm.
it's not entirely unreasonable for Arnaud to say that I wish I'd just been bored a couple of hundred yards away, and then I wouldn't be dealing with this pesky wealth tax that you want to impose. I mean, it's also worth saying that he has subsequently insisted that it had nothing to do with tax evasion. It was about the stability of the enterprise and the inheritance, and has renounced any the idea that this was ever serious. But across Europe, yes, there is absolutely locational politics. If you think about the Formula One race drivers or the tennis stars who tend to be residents of Monaco and indeed citizens of Monaco to take advantage of the very low tax rates there, that's quite typical. Liechtenstein, tax havens like that, or simply, countries like Ireland or indeed the Netherlands, both of which offer extremely advantageous tax conditions. So there is clearly this tax competition, but the very fact that it was a scandal in Arnault's case, I think points to and that he was ultimately forced to retract. I think points to actually how difficult it is for somebody of his ilk. I mean, I think a couple of billion here or there, and people will probably not notice. But if you're somebody, a whale of his size, I mean, overwhelmingly the richest person in France and the richest man in the world right now, for him to change his nationality remains, I think, something of a scandal in Europe.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, you refer to him as a whale, and I think the French had a pejorative term for people who were trying to evade taxes. I think they called them pigeons. So I think he was sort of this was part of the scandal. It was sort of being referred to as a pigeon by trying to flee the coop, I guess. But yeah, I guess this led to another set of questions about Arnault's political views and whether those are known. I mean, obviously, Arnault is a prominent figure in France, but is he a kind of political figure? Is he active in the political scene? And I guess if we do know what his views are they basically the same as wealthy people everywhere? Does sort of Arnault of France in a particular way, or does he kind of do his views transcend the kind of local issues?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that he's a low tax guy. I mean, his
Hmm.
beef with Hollande was over the wealth tax, and he backed Macron, continues to back Macron very actively. And one of the things that Macron did in his first term as president was abolish the wealth tax. So, gifting the likes of Arnault a considerable benefit. I mean, Arnault also hobnobbed with Donald Trump. I mean, very rich people who know each other. They're both in the hotel, luxury business, or at least Trump fancies himself to be in that line. Um, the most significant intervention of late has been his white knight role in connection with the leading French radio station, Europe 1, which was up for sale sensitively at the time of the recent presidential election in 2022. And that the fear of the Macron camp was that a rival oligarch, Vincent Bolloré, who is a huge name in infrastructure, in Franc-Afrique as well, was going to swoop in and convert a chain of radio stations to a right wing Fox News, pro Le Pen kind of stance. And at that moment, it's quite clear, I think, that the Macron camp was in touch with Arnault's team, and Arnault rapidly established a strong minority position in the ownership of the radio station, which is pretty hard to justify on other terms. It doesn't correspond to other interests of his business. But was extremely reassuring, I think, for the Macron camp to know that in the battles for control of the private media in France, they have an ally on their side who has both deep pockets and utter ruthlessness in his business dealings. So he is a figure, I think, above all, identified with Macron. He was with Macron on his recent trip to the United States. He's truly, I think, in that sense. And Macron himself positions himself as a somewhat unpolitical president in a way, but he is emphatically pro-business. He's emphatically pro-big business and a French presence in the world. And Arnault thoroughly represents that version of their vision of France's future.
I wanted to end with a question in parallel to the one that we previously posed in our segment about the Indian billionaire Gautam Adani. And so, what exactly does Arnault's wealth, his acquisition of this wealth, his use of it, what exactly does that tell us about what kind of country that France is? I mean, what kind of capitalism is at work here?
Yeah, it's a fascinating contrast, actually. I mean, interestingly, that Adani started out in luxury, if you like, in the diamond business, right? But the
Hmm.
Adani's route from there was into infrastructure, to ports, to railways, and now electricity generation. Whereas Arnault's route is to build, the most comprehensive global luxury brand, I think, the world has ever seen. I mean, now it includes Birkenstock for crying out loud. It's
Hmm.
hilarious. Everything from champagne to
I
German
didn't know
sandals.
that Birkenstock
Yeah,
is
there's a
not
very
German
recent.
anymore.
It's a very recent acquisition, and so two very different business models. Also, Adani, absolutely defined by the project, as we say in last time, of Indian nation building, whereas LVMH is a French branded firm, but only 20% of its workforce is in France. It operates globally. Its biggest market is the United States and then China and Asia. It sells a European version of luxury to the world, but it operates and is set up globally. It is incredibly untransparent about its supply networks for obvious reasons. It doesn't want to be tarnished with accusations of child labor or slave labor. It is one of the least transparent fashion brands in the world, like in a completely different league from the good faith actors like the Lululemons and the Adidases and even Gap, which have very rigorous policies in place. LVMH, like Prada and some of the other high-end houses, really makes very little effort, frankly, by the standards of those firms to ensure, or at least to publicly ensure and to be transparent about the way in which it ensures the integrity of its supply chain. So it's ruthless operator in that sense globalism, because it's evident that many of its shoes, which are branded as French or Italian made, are in fact basically stitched in Romania. It's quite clear that many of its leather goods come at various points through Bangladesh, and it's quite unclear what the circumstances of the labor employed there is. So it's a global organization rather than a national business. Where I think there is a degree of alignment is that it's very difficult to tell the story of Arnault's rise without repeated, not interventions exactly, but collaborations, if you like, with the French state. It's difficult to do business in France without at one point or other touching base with the power center. Elites in France are formed in a very, sociologists might say coherent way, others might say incestuous way. And Arnault is very much part of that kind of establishment.
Well, we will stop here, but we will be continuing to talk about kinds of luxury products with chocolate in just a second when we come back. Hi, and welcome back. The next data point is 7 million metric tons. That's the approximate total weight of all the chocolate that's eaten every year around the world. It adds up to $124 billion annual business. So, Adam, 70% of the world's cocoa is grown in West Africa these days. Although it turns out that it's a crop that originates from South America. So, what is the story here? How did cocoa go from a crop that only grew in Central America to one that was primarily now grown in West Africa?
Well, it's a long and complicated story, and it's not one that we can establish with real precision, because the origins of human cocoa culture are really to be found, we think, basically in the Mayan civilization, the traces of which were so comprehensively eradicated by European colonialism in the 15 and 1600s that our access to it was a hugely literate, highly complicated culture, but our access to its history is quite limited as a result of the destructiveness of the Western conquest. But no doubt, it's with the Mayans really that very high levels of cocoa civilization emerge, and it's not an easy thing, right? Because cocoa does grow on trees, but it's not exactly obvious how you get to the cocoa that we know, right? Because you have to take the beans from inside the pods, and then you have to dry them, which is a kind of fermentation process, and then you have to roast them, and then you can grind them up and you can make something delicious out of them. And cocoa is a good news story, because it is, in a sense, this human discovery of this absolutely delicious commodity, maybe by accident, because somebody got cross with the nasty taste of the beans in the pod and tossed them into a fire and discovered they were delicious. But in any case, we don't know. There's no really good origin story. But both Mayan and Aztec civilization had very elaborate cocoa cultures, up to and including using cocoa beans as a form of currency and a form of tax payment and tribute payment. And through then the European colonial networks, this extraordinary bean spreads around the world. Within the Dutch Empire, it spreads to Indonesia. But it's really the disintegration of notably the Portuguese Empire in the early 19th century, which brings it to where it will then establish itself as the main site of cultivation, which is West Africa. And it's in the course of the 20th century that the overwhelming majority of commercial chocolate that people eat assume it's coming from Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire.
So, what is the supply chain like from cocoa farm to the final chocolate product that we buy in our supermarket? I mean, how many middlemen are there exactly along the way, along that supply chain?
So it's a very dramatic supply chain, and I think that's really the message to put across in an episode like this. When we think about global supply chains, cocoa is arguably the most dramatic in its implications, because the cultivation of cocoa in West Africa, in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, is done by small peasant farmers. It really is an instance in which something that shows up in your daily diet in the West is coming from a peasant producer in some of the poorest places in the world. And considerable amounts of child labor, though efforts are made by both the local governments and local communities and the managers of the global supply chain to contain that. Within those countries, it's a three-step process, generally speaking. So you have peasants who sell to middlemen who collect the beans in bags after the initial drying. And from there, it's then taken to national purchasing agents. The national purchasing bodies then go to the global market. And in the global market, they encounter what some people called grinder roasters. So these are not the chocolate firms that everyone knows, but the powerful powerhouse commodity companies, 4 or 5 of them, who command the global trade. So they grind the cocoa sometimes in situ, they roast, and then they ship out, and it's those companies which then do the deals with the chocolate companies that everyone will know the names of: Mars, Mondelez, who own Kraft, Nestle, Ferrero, Hershey's, and Lindt Sprüngli, the Swiss giant. And then the final step in the chain is the retailers who buy the chocolate off and distribute the chocolate from the major producers. So it's 6 stages of a $130 billion industry, of which the original farmers maybe earn maybe 6% of the revenue, and 94% of it is distributed across this extraordinary extended chain.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed in reading about this is that the price of cocoa as a commodity is more volatile than the price of other agricultural commodities like wheat or corn. It goes up and down more than these other commodity products, and yet the price on the supermarket shelf is pretty steady. When I go to get some chocolate, I don't notice these big swings. And that got me wondering about, yeah, the role of these commodity traders that you mentioned, those middlemen. What role exactly are they playing in shaping this overall chocolate market? And yeah, then what role do they play in the deprivation of the cocoa farmers?
The price of chocolate does vary actually quite a lot. I mean, it moves slowly, and it's not necessarily something you buy literally every day. It's not like the famous price of gas in the United States, which people monitor daily as they refill their vehicles. It does fluctuate. At the other end of the chain, the two cocoa buying boards in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, which handle the vast majority of the beans, they do stabilize prices, but they stabilize prices on an annual basis. So for one harvest. So cocoa farmers in those regions go into the year knowing, broadly speaking, what the price is going to be. The variation for them comes on an annual basis as a result of the fluctuations in the power play between the marketing boards of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, the commodity trading middle firms in between, these grinder roaster firms, and then the chocolate firms who deal with the grinder roasters. And that's where the fluctuations arise from. They arise, broadly speaking, from demand and supply factors, but these are hugely financialized markets. They're all hedged, so with derivative contracts of different types. The fluctuations are massive. The players on all 3 sides are highly sophisticated market actors with differential access to credit, has to be said. So the marketing boards of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire don't have the same capacity to take out gigantic leveraged derivatives positions as the other 2 players in this system, but all of them are, knowledgeable, highly expert players, and the result is indeed a extraordinarily gyrating market. And when the cocoa price falls, the poverty, I mean, real serious starvation level poverty spreads across the cocoa growing belts of West Africa. It's an ongoing struggle. I mean, there's been talks about some kind of boycott really in the last couple of months. It's a very dynamic sector, and it's one of the few which has really resisted total liberalization.
So to shift to the side of production of the chocolate products that we buy in the supermarket, it's no secret that it's small countries like Belgium and Switzerland that have the reputation as the kind of premier chocolate producers in the world. And I guess I was wondering whether that's the product of colonial era ties and path dependence and knowledge accumulation, or is this really more a matter of modern investments in chocolate production and or just more modern marketing?
So, I mean, the cocoa system globally is a legacy of the colonial settlement system. I mean, all the way back to the original Western encounter disastrously with Central American culture. So that has to be said up front, because if you look at the history of Belgium and Switzerland, even in the Belgian case, it's less obvious that their emergence as hubs of very high end chocolate production in Europe is principally driven by colonial collection. And in fact, many of the innovations in chocolate technology were more attributable at key moments in the early 19th century to French producers. Much of the commercial spread of chocolate is a British thing. Perhaps some of the key technologies for producing modern, smoothly edible chocolate bars come from Germany. And so, in a sense, within an ecology which is thoroughly colonial, and which, the cultivation of cocoa outside Central America is, inherently an effect of imperial power. The emergence of Belgium and Switzerland as these major coffee centers, I think, has got more to do with local innovation cultures and then clustering, the same sort of clustering that we saw with perfume, for instance, where you get zones of expertise which are tied up with, for instance, in the Swiss case, the blending of chocolate with milk powder. That for us is a totally obvious thing to do, but it was in fact Swiss innovators in the 1830s that blended chocolate and milk for the first time to create milk chocolate. And in the Belgium case, the emergence of Belgium in the 19th century as a chocolate center is to a large extent, I think, the result of migration from Switzerland, which was at the time still a relatively poor part of Europe, to Belgium, which was a very prosperous, rapidly industrializing part of Europe, and a Swiss apothecary pharmacist called Jan Neuhaus moved to Brussels and established a shop in the 1850s where he was selling chocolate for medicinal purposes. And it's really out of that the emergence of the Belgian chocolate culture emerges, with famously the praline. So the praline is this very sophisticated sort of piece of chocolate engineering where you have a hard shell and a soft center.
Got it. Okay, so we have the Swiss to thank for milk chocolate. I did not
Yep.
did not know that it was actually them. I guess finally, I wanted to ask how patterns of chocolate consumption are changing around the world, if at all. I mean, specifically, I'm thinking here of the big emerging countries. I mean, do the Chinese like chocolate? How about in India? Are they consuming more chocolate than before? And then, frankly, what about the United States? I wonder, is there more kind of room to grow for Americans to consume chocolate than they already are?
So I mean the world of chocolate consumption is hugely uneven. I mean, the absolute world champions of chocolate consumption are the Europeans, with the Swiss up around almost 10 kilos a year. It's remarkable. If you fly to
Wow.
Switzerland, take a Swiss airline, they bombard you with chocolate the whole time. You're on the plane, you get chocolate when you sit down, you get chocolate when you leave. It's as though chocolate was some sort of essential to life. So they manage 10 kilos per year. The average for Europe is 7 kilos. America's consumption is some way below that. But the big question for the future is precisely the two countries that you've mentioned, because of their size and their rapid economic growth, and they're China and India. And they're interesting because they have very different dessert cultures, right? So Chinese dessert culture is not really centered on sweetness. There's Chinese baking, of course, or Chinese ice cream, but you'll know if you've tasted it that in fact it's more about flavor than it is about pure sweetness. And so, a milk chocolate culture in particular is not the most obvious thing for China to adopt, and that shows up in the data. So currently, compared to the 7 kilos that the Europeans eat on average, the Chinese manage 70 grams. So that's on average per capita a small chocolate bar per year for every Chinese person. So it's 1/100th of what the Europeans consume. So you can imagine how the the big chocolate players globally regard this market as this vast opportunity for growth. It may turn out that India is an easier sell, right? Because if anyone in the world has a sweet dessert culture, it's definitely the Indians. It's just they are the largest global consumers of sugar, in fact, in the world. But so far, chocolate's a relative novelty in Indian dessert and snack culture. Currently, their consumption's about 140 grams, so twice that of China, but still a long way short. And so if the European and American manufacturers could raise India or China to Japan's level of consumption — Japan is the champion of chocolate consumption in Asia at 2 kilos per year — it would transform the entire business. It would add 2 billion consumers. It would totally transform the market. And I think then the questions of equity in the supply chain would just become, impossible to ignore, because you would be talking about a sector that, rather than, as it were, pottering along at the level of inequality and exploitation, which, if we're frank, we have just become sort of habituated to, you would need to understand then how on earth you would expand that system, because that's what that kind of growth would require.
I'd be remiss not to ask whether you eat chocolate, Adam. Are you a fan of chocolate?
Oh, I am. Yeah. I mean, I grew up as a, in England. In fact, my father's family are from Bourneville, which is the factory town. I mean, it's actually a model community of Cadbury's, the long-time English firm, the Quaker family. It was like visiting Willy Wonka's chocolate factory.
I was going to say, you're making
going
it sound like Charlie in the Chocolate Factory.
Yeah, going to my grandparents' house, my dad's family, in Birmingham, was the whole place just smelled of chocolate. But it was, as a maturer person, I've acquired a taste for the finer things of life, and obviously single denomination. It's really fascinating. I mean, chocolate has such an astonishing range of flavors. And so, recently I've become an aficionado of high cocoa content, single origin type of chocolate, which, and to that extent, far less sweet, and something that's better enjoyed with wine or something like that.
So no Hershey bars for you. No.
I have to say I share most Europeans.
I was going to say,
just in comprehension with regard to American chocolate. I mean, even things like a Kit Kat, which you'd think would be the same, are not.
I've heard this unanimously, that American chocolate just doesn't do the trick. All right, we will leave it there for now. Again, a cheerful segment. We will continue talking about love and the economics of love in the weeks ahead. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It is produced by Laura Rossbrow-Tellem and Rob Sachs. Our social media manager is Claudia Tatey. The executive editor of FP Podcasts is Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested not just in Adam Tooze, but news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Ones and Tooze listeners even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That is TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love hearing your feedback. You can send us voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or you can email us, podcasts@foreignpolicy.com, or tweet us. That's at Ones and Tooze Pod. Thanks very much for listening, and we will see you back in your feed next week.